Hello students, today in this video we will talk about the second type of population interaction, that is competition. So this competition is a kind of interaction between two species where both suffer adverse effects. Both the species share the same resources like water, nutrients, space, sunlight, food, etc. So a famous naturalist, Darwin, believed that competition occurs only when the closely related species compete for the same resources that are limiting. That means if the resources are limiting, then competition occurs between closely related species only. And he was also convinced that organic evolution, that means evolution of organisms, was due to the interspecific competition. But all this was not entirely true. Now, let us study a few cases where unrelated species also compete for the same resource. Firstly, totally unrelated species compete for the same resource. Example, in some shallow South American lakes, the visiting flamingos and the resident fishes. That means flamingos are just visiting organisms. That means they visit that place from some other place, and resident fishes. So the fishes that is residing there. So between these visiting flamingos and resident fishes, they compete for the common resource, that means common food, that is the zooplankton. So from here we can see that this flamingo and fishes are totally unrelated species, but then they were competing for the common resource, that is the zooplankton. The second one is resource need not be limiting for competition to occur. That means it is not necessary that the resource has to be always limiting for the competition to occur. Even when the resources are abundant, competition occurs because of interference competition. That means the feeding efficiency of one of the species is reduced due to the interference and inhibitory presence of the other species. So in such cases, competition can be defined as a process in which fitness of one species is significantly lower in the presence of the another species. Example, abundant tortoise in Galapagos Islands. They became extinct within a decade right after the goats were introduced into that island. So that was apparently due to the greater browsing efficiency of the goats. That means we know that tortoise are very slow animal, and compared to tortoise, goats are much faster. So the greater browsing efficiency of goats, because of that, tortoise became extinct within a decade. Now the third one is competitive release. That is, due to the presence of a competitively superior species, a species is restricted to a small geographical area. This means because of the presence of a superior species, competitively superior species, the inferior species is restricted to only very small geographic area. Now, when the competing superior species is experimentally removed, if we remove them experimentally, then the inferior species, which was restricted to a very small area, they were found to be expanding its distributional range dramatically. So this is called competitive release. So here, one of the field experiment was done by Connell, and then it showed that the larger and the competitively superior barnacle, called Balanus, dominates the area, and the smaller barnacle Cathamalus is excluded from the zone, and it was restricted to a small area. So here, the Balanus, it was more superior, and then they excluded this Cathamalus, which was inferior, and then they were restricted to a very small area. So this is the example of competitive release. Now the fourth one is Gauss's competitive exclusion principle. So according to this principle, when resources are limited, the competitively superior species will eventually eliminate the other species. And then this principle states that two closely related species which is competing for the same resources cannot coexist, and the competitively inferior species will be eliminated. But this principle is true only if the resources are limiting, otherwise it is not true. So according to recent studies, instead of one species getting eliminated, the species facing competition, they were found to evolve mechanisms that promote them to coexist rather than exclusion. So one such example is resource partitioning. So what is resource partitioning? So this is, if two species compete for the same resource, they could avoid competing, or they could avoid the competition by choosing different times for feeding. That means they can feed at different times, or different foraging patterns. So this would allow them to coexist. One example was shown by this MacArthur by taking 5 closely related species of warblers. So these 5 closely related species of warblers were living on the same tree, and they were able to avoid the competition and coexist because of their behavioral differences in their foraging activities. That means they would feed on different parts of the tree at different times, and even their nesting period was different. So we can see that 5 types of warblers living on the same tree, they were able to avoid competition by sharing the resource. So this is called resource partitioning. So this is all about the population interaction competition.